Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 290, A Glorious Union. Throughout the nation, everyone rejoiced at the news of Mary's ascension. Mary was proclaimed queen on the 22nd of July, 1553, at Bridgenorth. Reportedly, bonfires were lit at every street. Little did everyone know, those bonfires were a sign of things to come. They just weren't the kind of bonfires everyone was expecting. But for the moment, nothing happened. The nation that summer was primed for a religious war that simply never came to fruition. From the pulpit, various evangelical preachers denounced both Mary and Elizabeth as bastards who would stop at nothing to return England to its papal past. Mary did her best not to fan these flames, though, truth be told. A not insignificant number of her supporters were Catholic, that is true. But she was very careful at this point. She based her claim to the throne on her legitimacy through her father, not on religion, at least for the moment. Her legitimacy was based on her father's will, which did, of course, designate her as her heir should Edward die without a child, which he did. Now, ultimately, the contest between those two queens from the last episode, Mary and Jane, was really a contest between two dead kings, Henry and Edward. Henry, I guess we shouldn't be surprised, won out. And so Mary had become queen. Now, there were some who believed the restoration of Henry VIII's daughter would mean a restoration not of Catholicism, but of his brand of religion, of the sort of compromise that had made his rule palatable for so many. But again, for the moment, Mary didn't move in any direction religiously. Abroad, evangelicals weren't fooled. They wrote prophesizing doom. This would be the end of the true religion in England. They knew it. Even if it didn't come quickly, it would happen. They weren't wrong either. By September in that year, every major evangelical preacher was either incarcerated in some way or had fled the realm. Even Bishop Cranmer found himself the unwilling guest of the Tower that very month. Interestingly, by and large, these men simply swapped places in these various prisons with the conservatives who had been locked up before them. As example, as Cranmer walked into prison, the old Bishop Gardiner walked out. And there were many other examples of the same sort of switcheroo. To some reformers, this was all a sign of God's displeasure. They needed to atone for some sin, even if they didn't really know what that sin was. That being said, others were just a lot more pragmatic about the whole situation. Paget, the former secretary to Henry VIII and Privy Council member under Edward VI, resolved to simply swallow his principles and serve the regime as he had under the other two kings. And by the end of July, as another example, Princess Elizabeth was in Mary's court, wishing her well, playing the good part, and she'd play the good Catholic part as much as she needed, by the way. Throughout England, many evangelical preachers suddenly and rather inexplicably had changes of heart. Before July was out, these men were just back to saying the traditional Mass as though nothing had changed. Perhaps the clock could be turned back, after all. At least in the summer of 1553, for a moment, to Mary it appeared like it might be. It was hard, of course, to determine which of these conversions or reversions, I suppose, were genuine and which were merely the product of force. None of them were clear-cut. Nowhere was the transition from old to new and back again more clear than during Edward's funeral. He had died, by the way, and we still hadn't had his funeral. So Mary ultimately relented and allowed Archbishop Cranmer to perform the service using the 1552 prayer book. It was his last public act as Archbishop, however. And meanwhile, in the Tower of London, Mary, who had not attended that funeral, was listening to Catholic requiems for her brother, uttered by none other than Stephen Gardiner, who was about to walk out of the Tower a free man. Now, things began to boil over, though, in August. On August 11th in London, a priest was interrupted while saying the traditional mass to chants of, quote, "You lie." A near riot ensued. Somebody threw a dagger, which struck straight into the pulpit, and they shot on that one. Now, interestingly, there's an argument that this episode was cooked, that it was completely choreographed by evangelicals who wanted to stir up trouble so that they would have an excuse to move people toward religious conflict. Now, absent more evidence, it's impossible to say whether this is true or not, but it's an interesting idea. If true, it's safe to say that these people didn't know what they were getting themselves into. A few days later, the Privy Council issued a decision to the town mayor, that's London, that all unlicensed preaching should be prevented. However, the decision came alongside a really interesting statement from Mary. Quote, "Albeit her grace's conscience is stayed in matters of religion, yet she meaneth graciously not to compel or constrain other man's consciences otherwise than God shall, or as she trusteth, put in their hearts a persuasion of the truth that she is in, through the opening of his word unto them by godly, virtuous, and learned preachers." End quote. This was an almost remarkable statement in favor of what sounds like religious toleration, especially for an age that had no concept of separation of church and state. But it was likely just a tactic. Mary knew that London, for the moment, was pretty decidedly against her. For the moment, she would not provoke the wrath of the capital. Mary followed up on this with another proclamation on the 18th of August, once again expressing her intention not to force religious conformity. Though she added for herself, at least, she, quote, "cannot hide that religion which God and the world knoweth she hath ever professed from her infancy," end quote. Of course, she means Catholicism. It was England's first ever declaration of formal religious toleration, albeit an explicitly temporary one. At least in the countryside, though, what all this meant was, in practical terms, Catholicism was back. It had never really completely left the rural parts of England. In fact, one contemporary remarked that by September the 3rd, there was hardly a parish in rural England in which Mass was not being said. Interestingly, Parliament had never repealed the Book of Common Prayer nor the requirement to use it. So for a few months at least, Mary's administration simply encouraged people to break the standing law, the laws under Edward VI, which for the moment were still in place. What they did was they simply refused to enforce those laws. For their part, evangelicals continued to hold to the letter of the law. Altars were rebuilt, and then under the law they were torn down, and then they were rebuilt again. Community was essentially in open schism. Once Parliament opened in October, the evangelicals, however, lost even their legal standing. On October the 1st, Mass was said before the Queen's official coronation. On October the 5th, Mass was said again, this time for the opening of Parliament. Edwardian clergymen protested noisily but ineffectually. Parliament then proceeded to invalidate all the religious legislation enacted under Edward VI. They just wiped it away. Clerical marriage was overturned. Divine service was returned to the age of Henry VIII, not before, and that's going to be a key sticking point. There remained some pockets of resistance. One firebrand evangelical preacher continued using the Book of Common Prayer until late December 1553. On January the 3rd, 1554, 30 London preachers were hauled before a tribunal, which demanded to know why Mass was not being said in Latin. Apparently so much for religious toleration, right? At least so far as the government was concerned, the war for the Mass was over. The conservative faction had won and everybody had to get in line. Yet, as always, I need to remind you, Conformity cannot be taken for true acceptance. Really, what we have going on in England between 1547 and 1554 is, in the words of one great historian, I'm not one of those, a kind of protracted theological symposium involving the entire country, and one in which the people actually got to vote, at least in some ways. But if Mary and her advisors took all of this as evidence that the war over England's religion was a done deal, they were sadly mistaken. No one wanted another War of the Roses. That was very true. But once the dust from the succession crisis settled, there was no way of knowing that the people would resist these efforts at religious conformity. On the 12th of November, 1553, James Brooks, master of Balliol College, Oxford, and chaplain to Stephen Gardiner, took his turn in the pulpit at Paul's Cross. His sermon was a powerful lament for the sins of the schism, a time, he said, of, quote, change in doctrine, change in books, change in tongues, change in altars, change in placing, change in gesture, change in apparel, change in bread, change in giving, change in receiving, with many changes more, so that we had still change upon change, and like never to have left changing till all the world had been changed. End quote. To remedy this, in his opinion, was a return to the true Catholic Church, to the mystical body of Christ. Brooks' sermon would later be reprinted, yet a couple of words curiously, Pope, Holy Father, and Bishop of Rome, were all omitted. By Christmas 1553, Mary had very effectively turned back the clock to 1547, to the Church of Henry VIII. Reunion with Rome, however, would be another matter. For years, people had been bombarded with claims and allegations of papal depravity. To get people to suddenly accept reunion with Rome would be a tall order. And it's worth pointing out that even some conservative preachers, such as Stephen Gardiner himself, weren't willing to turn back the clock prior to 1547, at least not initially. One piece of Edwardian legislation was still very much in place, the Chantries Act of 1553. You see, back under Henry VIII, a lot of people had supported the dissolution of the monasteries. A lot of people had bought church property. Now, technically, canon law held that you could not alienate church property from the church. The Chantries Act gave legal protection to those who had bought those lands. And purchasers of monastic lands had every reason to feel nervous in early 1554. Gardiner himself had once written in support of the dissolution. His evangelical opponents, now somewhat gleefully, pointed out how closely he was skirting hypocrisy. Across the English Channel, everyone watched affairs in England. Rome was overjoyed. For decades, kingdom after kingdom had leaked away from Rome. Now it looked like Mary, dubbed the Queen of Heaven by the Pope, would reverse this trend. On August the 5th, 1553, Pope Julius III appointed Englishman Reginald Pole his official legate to England. His instructions were to reconcile the English people to the Roman Church. He even had authority to absolve people who had purchased monastic lands so long as they at least made a token gesture of offering to return them first. But the mood in Rome quickly soured. Many cardinals believed it was too early to just launch Pole into action. They believed Mary needed time to consolidate her government before England could be reconciled to the Roman Catholic Church. The imperial advisors, also constantly present in her court, counseled Mary to be patient. The Mass was easy. Restoring relations with Rome and dealing with property issues were much bigger asks. Better, they said, to move slowly. Parliament had been willing to declare Catherine of Aragon's marriage to Henry valid, but for the moment, that was all. A scheme to restore religious law to 1532 and therefore restore Rome's supremacy through sort of backdoor legislation was ultimately rejected. For the moment, the English Church would stay in limbo, allied to Rome, but independent of it. But there was more to being queen than simply religion. Mary had other pressing affairs to deal with as well. The most pressing of these was her need to marry. For her line to continue, she needed an heir. Moreover, there was a huge stigma against women in positions of power in Tudor England. Henry VIII himself had written in 1532, with Mary firmly in mind, by the way, a female ruler, quote, cannot govern long without a husband, end quote. Mary's instincts were to seek a renewed dynastic union with the Habsburgs. Initially, she thought about Charles V, far too old for her, but whatever, though he quickly nixed that suggestion. Instead, he pushed for union with his son, the Spanish-born Philip. He was a widower since 1545, when his then-wife died, giving birth to their son. There was really only one domestic alternative anyway, a guy by the name of Edward Courtenay, Earl of Devon. Edward, a staunch conservative, had just been released from the Tower on Mary's accession. And in the Tower, Edward had become very close to Stephen Gardiner, who now pushed his cause. Courtenay's candidacy never really got off the ground, though. He was not suited to be king. He was rash and intemperate. Plus, he had been a prisoner since he was 12 years old and really had no courtly connections at all. A marriage to him would bring Mary few, if any, benefits. Regardless, Mary made up her mind quickly. On October 29th, she swore to marry Philip before the imperial ambassador. The news quickly leaked, and Mary found herself summoned before the House of Lords to explain the decision. She was irked at that, complaining a male would never have been treated thusly. She wasn't wrong, but it didn't matter. The English lords were set, at the moment, against having a Spanish king. Gardiner realized, probably rightly, that a Spanish match combined with a full Catholic restoration was more than the kingdom could stomach. These were problems that became exponential when they were combined. Now, sadly, as we'll see, Mary's not going to listen. If Philip is the man about to become the King of England, we should probably know something about him. Philip, as we know, was the firstborn son of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. Due to the lengthy absences of his father, he mainly grew up with his mother, absorbing a Spanish mentality and lifestyle. Born in Valladolid on the 21st of May, 1527, he would have been 27 at the time he married Queen Mary. The prince was an intelligent child and received an all-around education, making him one of the smartest monarchs of the time. He developed a passion for collecting books and art objects, but he also collected mechanical instruments and a lot of relics. Philip II of Spain was very much a man of the age. Certainly, he was a monarch of the age. In fact, he might be what we could properly describe as the first early modern monarch. He was a respected lawyer and advised his bureaucrats to, quote, learn about the personality of their children, end quote, by which, of course, he meant his people. Like many people, he believed in astrology. In fact, he had both he and Mary's horoscopes prepared by the English magician, John Dee. But he could also be very skeptical of magic. On one occasion, when presented by a classical source on astronomy, he claimed the entire thing was hogwash, noting how, because the Romans were not Christians, they could not believe anything they liked. But that hardly made it true. Philip, like many monarchs at the time, was seduced by the allure of alchemy. He wanted to be able to turn metals into gold and silver. And of course, he had good reason, as we'll find out, to want that. Philip was always short on money, something he inherited from his father. In fact, he had to suspend interest payments to his bankers in 1577. Eventually, however, he learned his lesson and would later describe alchemy as a fake science, as a great hoax. He would support pharmacists until the end of his life, though. Philip was a big believer in early modern medicine, even if most of it was nothing but quack cures. Philip knew he could not prolong his life forever, but he certainly hoped to use whatever means at his disposal to extend it somewhat. The consultants who worked at the famous palace of Philip II, the Escorial, epitomized the spirit of adventure, experimentation, empiricism, and faith that infused almost every facet of Spanish and European culture. One aspect, perhaps, of the same spirit of discovery that had launched the Spaniards on their conquest of the New World. An English Catholic called Richard Stanhorst wrote a small tract specifically for Philip entitled The Touchstone of Alchemy, explaining how to distinguish between charlatans and the true practitioners of the art. He wrote, quote, "Be neither unduly credulous nor wholly disbelieving, for the Indies would have gone undiscovered if no one had believed Columbus." End quote. While Philip clearly kept an open mind about astrology and the wider claims of alchemy, he was deeply and obsessively superstitious about the power of religious relics. As Protestants across his ancestral domains in Northern Europe publicly abandoned their faith in these sacred talismans, he had an army of agents at work, acquiring as many desiccated cadavers, heads, and other saintly body parts, hairs from the head of the Madonna, and pieces of the true cross as they could find, kind of like ancient, questing Nazis from the old Indiana Jones movies. Luther had joked of the widespread forgery of relics, that 300 men would not be enough to carry all the pieces of the cross then revered across Christendom. And Philip was greatly amused that his enthusiasm had encouraged a flourishing cottage industry, foraging for the full range. This accumulation of sacred bits and pieces was clearly in part of a political charge, affirmation of the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation. In other words, spending all this money to acquire parts of the true cross wasn't anything about the cross itself necessarily. It was about affirming the values of Catholicism. It could also be a demonstration of his centralizing power, as was his compulsory purchase of St. Lawrence's head from a convent in Santiago de Compostela, in the face of bitter opposition from the nuns and archbishop there. But he also believed very much. He amassed 7,449, just one shy of 7,500, individual relics by the time of his death. And as he lay dying, agonizing, his body bursting with sores, his blood poisoned, unable to move from his soiled bed, racked by fever and thirst, he sustained himself for an incredible 53 days by putting his faith in these objects of devotion. He had amongst him St. Sebastian's knee, Alban's rib, and Vincent Ferrer's arm, placed next to his own corresponding and painful body parts, as he listened to readings from Teresa of Avila. Philip was, therefore, in the words of many, and I suppose this typifies the very age, the end of the 16th century, middle to end of the 16th century, a man and a period of great contradictions. In 1548, Philip left Spain for the first time, spending several years visiting the various territories under Habsburg dominion. He also met representatives of the Austrian line of the dynasty. In contrast to most of the Habsburgs from the generations that preceded him, who, as a rule, experienced an extremely polyglot and international upbringing, Philip had grown up in Spain with Castilian Spanish as his mother tongue, and he hadn't really learned any other languages. He spoke very little French, Italian, or German. Reinforced by his aloof nature, this shortcoming is going to hinder communication with those who did not speak Spanish, and in fact, hinder his ability to communicate with Queen Mary. As a result, he soon acquired a reputation for arrogance, especially amongst his Austrian relatives. In the Low Countries, he encountered the rich cultural life of these regions, which was, as we're going to find out, to leave a very lasting mark on him. For the rest of his life, though, he would be a keen collector of the works by the Flemish masters. Philip did not succeed his father, Charles V, as ruler of Spain, the Low Countries, and various Italian domains until 1555, when Charles V finally and permanently retired. At that time, Charles severed his European empire, granting his Austrian and German holdings to his brother Maximilian. Thus, at the time that Philip was engaged to Mary, he was on the cusp of becoming one of the most powerful men in Europe. But he wasn't quite there yet. The terms of the marriage were thrashed out in early December. Children of the match would inherit England and the Netherlands, but have no claim to Spain and its empire, while Don Carlos's line continued. Philip, as joint sovereign, would receive the title of king, but retain no rights in England if Mary predeceased him. Moreover, he was not to exercise authority in his own right, grant English offices to foreigners, or take the queen abroad without the consent of the nobility. The strikingly restrictive provisions were designed to alleviate anxieties in England. Philip considered them demeaning and swore secretly that he did not consider himself bound by them. Even without knowing that, some Englishmen decided that the marriage must be stopped, and Mary forcibly removed from the throne. The conspiracy that was hatched in November, 10 days before Mary rebuffed the parliamentary delegation, 4 members of Parliament, among them Sir Peter Carew and Thomas Throckmorton, met secretly with other prominent figures, including the former clerk to the council, William Thomas, the former Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir James Croft, a former Gloucestershire MP and member of the Council in the Marches, Sir Nicholas Arnold, and the Kentish landowner and soldier Sir Thomas Wyatt. All were staunch evangelicals. They were soon joined by the Duke of Suffolk, who had escaped lightly, only a few days' imprisonment in the Tower, for his part in the pseudo-reign of his daughter. The plan was to replace Queen Mary with the Princess Elizabeth. She would have the legitimacy conferred upon her by Henry VIII's will, and moreover, she would then be married to Edward Courtenay, the man that Mary rejected for Philip, who was brought into the scheme, though he remained patently unreliable. The French were also very much in on the plot, as Henry II in Paris had 0.0% interest in seeing a Habsburg on the English throne. Elizabeth, for her part, was aware of the plot, but never intimately involved. She continued to play the part of the dutiful half-sister throughout Christmas 1553. Regardless, the elaborate plan never came to pass. On January 2nd, 1554, Philip arrived in London, to mostly a shower of jeers and a couple of stones. That same day, the Privy Council convinced a nervous Sir Peter Carew that the government was very much in on him and knew about his little conspiracy. By January the 18th, suspicious activity in French ports led many to believe an invasion was imminent. 3 days later, Archbishop Gardiner got Edward Courtenay to spill the proverbial beans on the whole thing, and the conspirators all fled the capital like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Most went to the countryside, but Sir Peter boarded a ship for exile in France that same week. He was done conspiring. Wyatt was not. In Kent, he raised the standard of rebellion with the usual claims that this was not about the Queen, but rather about ridding her of her wicked advisors. The message he was peddling was easy to predict. The Spanish were coming. They would dominate England. Unless the marriage was stopped right now, the Pope would be in charge. Now, Wyatt was actually pretty successful in Kent. More noble families fought with him than against him, though most remained aloof. The "watch out for the Spanish" message was a good one. On January the 28th, the Duke of Norfolk led an army of 500 men to try and destroy Wyatt, but his men promptly defected to the rebels. Evidently, this had been prearranged, by the way. Wyatt now had 3,000 men and nothing between him and London. But in a tale as old as time, he moved too slowly. Anti-Spanish sentiment in London was reaching a fever pitch, yet he dithered. taking pointless royalist house after pointless royalist house, all while giving Mary the time to regroup and recover. Mary remained firm in the capital. She would not flee. Instead, she delivered a series of rousing and somewhat misleading speeches to London citizenry. I mean, if Wyatt can make stuff up, she can too, right? She claimed Wyatt was coming to sack London. She said he wasn't, and they needed to band together to stop him. Ultimately, Wyatt didn't reach London until the 3rd of February. But by the 7th, he still seemed poised to take the city. Had he moved faster, he almost certainly would have. Yet, Mary remained firm. She refused to leave, and in the end, that was enough. London refused to open its gates. Wyatt suddenly found his supporters melting away. They were in no mood for a siege. Wyatt then allowed himself to be arrested. While Mary later would claim that she had been saved by divine intervention, she had not. She had been saved by what was essentially London's own referendum on her rule. London had picked sides. It would keep Queen Mary. For now. There was an inevitable reckoning. In London, quote, "One sees nothing but gibbets and hanged men," end quote, a witness wrote on the 17th of February. Wyatt was executed, as was now the Duke of Suffolk, and about 100 others at various places in London and Kent. The bulk of the Kentish participants were pardoned by the Queen in a choreographed show of royal mercy, after being paraded before her with symbolic halters around their necks. Courtenay, likewise, was pardoned. There was merciful justice, perhaps more than she deserved, for the woman the conspirators intended to be Courtenay's consort. Letters seized from the French ambassador's courier implicated the Princess Elizabeth. It was the view of some that for the safety of the realm, including, by the way, Archbishop Stephen Gardiner, that Elizabeth had to die. But despite some close questioning in the Tower, no really solid evidence could be found, and Wyatt performed Elizabeth a last service by swearing at his execution on the 11th of April that neither she nor Edward Courtenay was privy to his plans. In May, Elizabeth was sent from the Tower to house arrest in Woodstock, Oxfordshire. Here, she let the mask slip a little bit, demanding an English Bible and the right to recite the litany in English, quote, "set forth in the King, my father's days," end quote. But when ordered to desist and conform fully to Catholicism, she did it. Mary was lenient, even imprudently so. Yet a full treason trial, which lacked unanimous support from the Privy Council, carried risks as well. In April, to the dismay and fury of the government, Nicholas Throckmorton was spectacularly acquitted of treason. It was almost unprecedented, frankly, but Throckmorton conducted a brilliant defense, challenging the selection of the jurors and arguing it was not treason under existing law, quote, "to talk against the coming hither of the Spaniards," end quote. Angered by demonstrations of rejoicing at this acquittal, Mary took to her bed, and the jury was fined and imprisoned. On the day of the verdict, Wyatt's head was stolen from its place of public display, an indication that the traitor was considered by some to be a martyr. Now, as I mentioned previously, there was no mercy for Jane Grey, who had actually still been in the Tower. Her sentence of death had been suspended since November. At this point, it was promptly carried out. The young lady was only 16 years old. Now, the battle at this point was far from over. Sure, Mary would get the marriage that she wanted, but the notion that England would be quickly and easily reconciled to Rome remained very much a fanciful one. And as we were going to see next week, the reality was much, much more complicated. If you've enjoyed the show, feel free to check out the links in the show notes below. The link there to the website that has all the additional content. And I also have a link to a free trial of Western Civ 2.0. Being a patron is the number one way that you can support the show. It goes as low as $1 a month. That's $12 a year, and you don't have to listen to the ads anymore. Or if you'd like all the bonus content of Western Civ 2.0, you can check that out. Various options remain for that as well.